Okay. Well, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Sarah Ann Rennick. I'm the Deputy Director for Research at the Arab Reform Initiative. And today's webinar is titled Palestine in the Political Imaginary: Perspectives from the Global South. And this webinar is part of a new series that we have started called Palestine Insight that is seeking to explore the concept of recentering Palestine. How can we recenter Palestine within the region, the Arab region, within regional security, regional peace, but also more broadly within global politics and within the international order? This webinar is going to be exploring today the role of Palestine in politics and in the national consciousness from different perspectives and different places in the global South. And more specifically, we're going to be looking at these issues from the perspective of Mexico and Latin America more broadly, from the perspective of South America, and from the perspective of Indonesia. We're interested in looking at the resonance of the Palestinian cause in these different locations, the popular resonance, but also the political resonance of the Palestinian question. We're interested in looking at how the current war is being shaped in the media. What are the media narratives about the war, and the extent to which the current conflict could lead to some forms of realignment, geopolitical realignments. And I have the privilege of being joined today by three experts in these topics, in these issues. We have Dr. Marta Tawir-Kuri, who is a research professor on international relations, foreign policy analysis, and Middle East politics at the Center for International Studies at the College of Mexico. We have Ms. Roshan Dadu, who is coordinator of the South Africa BDS Coalition and member of Palestine Solidarity Campaign. And Dr. Ahmed Omar, who is sessional lecturer at the School of Political Science and International Studies at the University of Queensland. And I should say that we have some commentaries that have been written by our speakers today that are available on the Arab Reform Initiative website. We have a commentary by Marta and Omar, and Roshan's commentary should be coming out this week. So please, if you're interested in this discussion, want to have more reading around that, I highly encourage you to go to the website and read their commentaries. So today's webinar will be 1 hour long. We're going to structure it around 3 prompts. So I'll have a prompt for each speaker and do it in 3 rounds. And then we'll open it up at the end for some questions. So for those who are interested in asking questions, please write those in the Q&A on the Zoom, or for those joining us on Facebook Live, you can do this from the comments section, and those will be directed to us. We also have simultaneous translation available into Arabic, and this webinar is being recorded. So I suggest that we jump right in, actually, because we have a lot of ground to cover and very little time. So I'm going to start perhaps with you, Marta. For the first question, again, this will be addressed to all 3 speakers. We can start with Marta. I wanted if you could comment on the dominant narratives in the local and the national media of this conflict. How is this conflict being portrayed in the media in Mexico and in Latin America more broadly?
Well, hello. Thanks for having me. Great to see you, meet you all. Well, yes, with some very few exceptions, in Mexico, the representation of Palestine by all prestige newspapers, for example, across the ideological spectrum, and by some national TV news networks since 2008 until now, is based on much enthusiasm for Israel and ambivalent sympathy for Palestinians. In all newspapers, leftist, conservative, and many TV national news networks, the dominant narrative is one where Israel's actions are always reactions or responses to the attacks of the Palestinians, a narrative in which Palestinians are equated with Hamas. The narrative is shared and reinforced by many organic intellectuals, figures which have a professional standing, but who have not studied the Middle East and the Palestinian question systematically nor rigorously. and who rises key analysts from within, a social class, and from the fact of being Jewish, or former diplomats, ambassadors to United States mainly, former ambassadors, and to Israel. And they all speak of Israel as a plural, secular, inclusive, democratic state that honors its founding values, who equate Russia's war against Ukraine with Hamas' war against Israel. Hamas here being depicted as the actor contributing to the breakdown of the international order. And Israeli responsibility is also discursively mitigated by pointing at the existence of extremist minorities within both sides, by highlighting the plight of the Arab Jews when they were displaced from Arab countries, by saying that Palestinians' bad choices have led them to the path of uncertainty that they find themselves now. So, and they also decry the slogan "From the river to the sea" is a call to exterminate Israel. That is repeated permanently, and label also serious scholars as soft supporters of terrorism when they offer appropriate historical and sociological context. And these people are really very present in the media, especially TV media, where normal, the majority of Mexicans get their news from.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that very thorough overview from the perspective of Mexico. Roshan, for you, same question. What are the dominant narratives in the local and national media on the conflict from the South African perspective? Oh, sorry, you're muted.
Sorry. Hi, thanks. I think it's probably more of a mixed bag than what Marta was saying, although because we have a kind of weak journalism, in the sense that a lot of newsrooms are very under-resourced and not, no longer have very experienced and senior journalists, nor do they have correspondents around the world in different places. They often pick up the Western narrative, the narrative of Israel war against Hamas, almost in a lazy way, not necessarily out of a conviction, I would say. Some, of course, do have the conviction, are very, very pro-Israeli, and have been, kind of really censoring the coverage of any pro-Palestinian activities. But having said that, I think we do get quite a bit of coverage, for instance, on our national broadcaster of demonstrations and marches. We do get invited on for commentary and comments. In the print media, we do manage a lot of the time, not always and not in all publications, to get op-eds published or commentary, or we get asked for comments by journalists. But there's very clearly pro-Zionist media in the country as well. And, that in those cases, they don't want to hear from us at all. So I think it's, in fact, a reflection of our politics, which we'll get into later, but a kind of a mixed bag of coverage. I think in the rest of the continent, though, it's also very much an Israeli narrative that's driven particularly because of the influence of Christian Zionism in the continent. So there are quite a few countries that will follow the Israeli narrative, again, possibly often taking the kind of the framing from the Western media. But yeah, it is still a challenge to really change the narrative, to present a pro-Palestinian narrative in a concerted way. I mean, we do have Muslim radio stations and TV channels, so those stations, of course, will invite pro-Palestinian voices and Palestinians to be heard on the show, but then that's reaching only a very particular sector of society, which is important, but isn't reaching more broadly.
Okay, thank you. And for you, Omar, same question.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Sarah. I think one important thing that we need to consider in Indonesia's responses and how Indonesian citizens perceives the war in Gaza is that it is overwhelmingly pro-Palestinian. And I think there are three important narratives that has been emerging in Indonesia, not only this year, but it has been shaping Indonesia's responses and Indonesia's solidarity indicates. The first is anti-colonialism. This is something that I think the Foreign Minister Retno Marsudi perceives when she makes a response on behalf of Indonesia's foreign ministry, in which she emphasizes the two-state solution as not only as the long-term way to deal with the conflict, but also to understand the roots of the conflict, which is related to the denial to the rights of self-determination for Palestinians. And this is something that has been reiterated not only by the government, but also by Indonesian community leaders, especially those associated with the dominant PDIP party in Indonesia, which is a strongly nationalist government. And the second is obviously this is the Muslim solidarity, which has been prominent in decades, because the war in Gaza has the victims of the war is mostly the Muslim community, the Muslim Palestinians, and then this has been driving strongly the Indonesia's responses towards the Palestine, and this is something that also characterizes the rally, the solidarity among the Islamic groups in Indonesia, which has played a very strong role in the society. And the third, which is related to the government's official response, is humanitarianism. I think the government has been trying to shape the response through the humanitarian aid and assistance. So these are the three things that informs Indonesia's overwhelming pro-Palestinian responses during the war.
Okay. Thank you very much. I mean, what you all are presenting actually is quite quite different from one location to another, as we can see in terms of these dominant narratives and which narratives are stronger and in which media sources they're stronger. Just following up on that and what you were saying, Marta, I mean, Roshan, kind of you hinted at the more broadly in the continent and some of the differences within the continent. I'm wondering, you gave the perspective of Mexico. What about other places in Latin America? Do you see differences in these media narratives?
No, actually, I mean, at least for example, for Colombia, no. And I would say that was what Roshan was pointing out, that it is also what I just described in Mexico, and what happens also, for example, in Colombia, is the result of a lack of training and an supportive editorial environment, of course. Also, I mean, journalists they take normally that we don't have any correspondence in the Middle East. No one, not a single broadcast, news service in Mexico has a correspondent in the Middle East. They're not interested. I mean, they're just so there's a lack of resources also. So there's not a supportive editorial environment for that. So that's the laziness part of all this. But the role of the individuals and Colombia as well, the individuals I was talking about, and this discursive representation of the conflict serves to project this particular cultural expectations. They're very punctual with their presentations, with their representations, yes, and this talk shows and this news soir services, and they project this political and ideological alignments. And they also, for example, the case of Mexico, they enhance particular identities. They insist very much on the North American identity. And in Colombia, of course, it's not that the case, but in other ways, you see this this spaces, for example, the day-to-day life of the media in countries like Mexico or Colombia shows also that the media remain disconnected from the academy concerning Palestine, or the efforts. They exist. Many of us are invited, but the efforts are very fragmented, and they don't follow. They don't follow the news. They're not really interested in the analysis, but also in moments, of crisis, and they don't give time. They don't like, they don't like to give this context about what's happening. So yeah, the two worlds remain disconnected. I would say more perhaps in Colombia, but in general, I mean, it happens, and I think it happens in general overall in Latin America.
Okay, thank you. And I'm wondering, and I guess any of you want to take this question, but have you seen a shift in the media narrative or in these presentations as the conflict has gone on from October 7th until today, December 18th? Has there been any shifts, even in the attention that's being paid to the conflict? For example, maybe there's less attention being paid to it, or maybe there is different news that's coming out, or is it mostly the same as it was even 2 months ago? Roshan, for example?
I think that there is a lot of coverage given, and the sort of the narrative line is very, mainstream pro-Western, but then they might have guests onto shows if it's broadcast media, or there will be op-eds that would be allowed to be published, or rights of reply. At the moment, I mean, we obviously in South Africa have an indigenous Zionist population. At the beginning, they were quite quiet, but they've started now to launch, attacks on individuals, on organizations, and to be more present in the media, more assertive again in the media. So then we would use the right of reply to challenge that. One of the print media did say, they suddenly said, oh, well, we are tired now of this, because they have this notion of balance. So if they publish something that the BDS coalition has written, then they must publish something saying the opposite. I mean, it's a silly notion of balance, but anyway, then they said, no, we are fed up now with this whole story, and we're no longer going to publish op-eds on it, which is kind of weird, but so that they wouldn't not ever publish a pro-Palestinian or pro-BDS movement piece, but at the same time, then it's like, oh, we've had enough of this now, because they insist on doing, the sort of one for one, so it doesn't take the conversation forward. It's constantly like that. But yes, at the moment, we're rebutting a lot of the nonsense that the local Zionist Federation and Board of Deputies are putting out in the media, which they hadn't actually at the beginning. They were much more quiet.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Yeah. And Omar, in Indonesia, has the media narrative or the attention paid in the media changed over the last couple of months to the conflict?
I think there's not many changes in the media narratives. I think what is changing is the narratives towards the Palestinian tends to be stronger, and I think this is starting from when the Israeli Defense Force started to the ground invasion in Gaza. So this is something that characterizes the narrative, because the media narratives, even not only the government media, but also the liberal media, characterizes the invasions as the something that puts the Palestinians as victims. For example, the Jakarta Post, one of the liberal-leaning media in Indonesia, published an editorial, I think in November, during the early invasions, and they said that the world is failing Gaza, and this is something that is not this is something that is not usually covered by the media, because the media tends to be highlighting the individual freedom, and something that is more towards west leaning perceptions. So this is something that I think characterizes even the most liberal Indonesians, tends to be pro-Palestinian. At least they are condemning the invasions that brings the victims towards the Palestinians. Only a small number of Indonesians who perceives solidarity towards the Israel society, and even it's now diminishing. So they're with the continued invasion, it's not something that is comes prominence in the media.
Okay, thank you. What you're just talking about actually leads me straight to my next question, which is, the resonance of the Palestinian cause with other causes that are nationally that resonate contextually. So, for example, in South Africa, the apartheid, of course, and the anti-apartheid struggle. To what extent does the Palestinian cause resonate given the context of apartheid in South Africa and the liberation from the apartheid regime?
Yeah, I mean, I think our two countries are inextricably tied together because in 1948, as the Nakba was taking place and the state of Israel was imposing itself on Palestine, it was exactly when the National Party came to power in South Africa. And the first person to call Israel an apartheid state was, in fact, Hendrik Verwoerd, the first the first apartheid, or the architect of apartheid and implementer of apartheid in South Africa, who said that Israel, like South Africa, is an apartheid state in the 1960s. And those two regimes worked very closely together. And that is also part of the reason we still today have a lot of those relationships still that remain with apartheid Israel. So the regimes identified each other very clearly, and they collaborated on nuclear weapons. Both countries developed nuclear weapons. Post-94, South Africa decommissioned the apartheid nuclear arsenal. Israel has admitted it's got nuclear weapons when it said it wanted to throw them on Gaza. I mean, I think that may be the first time it's admitted to it, but we know, of course, that it has nuclear weapons. Other military collaboration. Israel was a sanction-busting state when international sanctions were imposed. I mean, the only country that recognized the South African Bantustans as independent states. So that there's that connection between the apartheid regimes, and then of course there's the connection between our liberation movements, and especially like from the time of the non-aligned movement. And the role Indonesia played, Nasser in Egypt, and that kind of, in a way, a sort of flowering of third worldism, as it was called then. Now people call it the global south, I don't know. And the liberation movements were meeting each other all the time. Of course, the Soviet Union and the Eastern European states that supported both factions in the PLO armed struggle and our own, as well as other, not just armed aid to liberation movements. So there was a very close relationship. But I think kind of post-Oslo, certainly, the PA in its embassies as in Africa have been very weak. They've assumed, I think, that this support would continue, that this would go on. And they have had no Africa policy, basically. At the same time, Israel has realigned and developed a new Africa policy, an extractivist version based on its, startup nation, high tech, and instead of giving so much direct development assistance, funding these little Israeli high tech companies to come to sell their rubbish to governments here. And our governments here are buying it, particularly authoritarian ones, because it's weapons and spyware, and under the cover of this kind of development assistance and agri-tech and water tech, the greenwashing and water washing, blue washing. So I think that's really shifted. And so now countries have developed very strong relations with Israel, and in a way, the misuse of Christian Zionist theology that has mushroomed in the continent has sort of made a cover for the government by winning the hearts and minds. And it's really extraordinarily difficult to challenge. I mean, there are in South Africa, at least, church leaders who are really fighting. I mean, they're fighting like in the World Council of Churches against the Western churches, who want to block any kind of notion of Israeli apartheid or any kind of movement towards supporting Palestinians, even Palestinian Christian churches, but also the least support comes from African churches for this fight back, because they are funded by mostly Western evangelical, often churches that it depends on your support for Israel. And this narrative that if you don't support the Jews or pray for the Jews to be in Israel, then you will be damned to eternity. So, you know, to argue against that around issues of apartheid and colonialism, especially with a younger generation who don't remember, even now in South Africa, obviously remember apartheid, that analogy is not so meaningful, so personally meaningful. And because a lot of people in the continent are disillusioned by the very liberation movements that came to power. I mean, and that in a way is reflected in Palestine as well, certainly out post-Oslo. So that sort of link is, in a way, I think, has been broken, although obviously we're trying to raise up all the time that it's not a religious issue, it's a decolonial issue, it's a settler colonial state, just like South Africa and Algeria. And that those, you know, that therefore what we should be doing is supporting the people who have the legitimate right to resist occupation and apartheid and settler colonialism, and, you know, trying to reframe it in that way, or reframe it back in that way that I think there was once. I mean, the African Charter explicitly mentions fighting racism, apartheid, and Zionism, but most African Charter on Human and People's Rights, but most countries seem to have be ignoring that aspect. Well, it's very explicit, so it shows that, you know, at that time there was that understanding. So there is, in a way, that framework still, but to try to rekindle that is, you know, in order to change that narrative and to make people feel the support. You know, I mean, obviously at the moment there's this humanitarian outpouring. I think a lot of people just feel, no, this must be wrong. We can't see these hospitals and children being killed and the scale of it. We're watching a genocide, but then from that, you know, as an activist, to sort of sustain a political campaigning organization that can continue to put pressure and extend that pressure, particularly in our Pan-African Palestine Solidarity Network, is, you know, is to try to re-look at this, remind people, or re-look at how to frame what is going on as an anti-colonial struggle and Zionism as a racist, as no nationalist, settler colonial project.
Thank you very much. Marta, for you, same question. I mean, what is the resonance of this issue, given that in, you know, many parts of Latin America, there are very strong land rights movements, for example, anti-colonial movements. Is there a popular resonance of the Palestinian cause, given those same types of struggles in Latin America?
Yes, there is. Palestine's place in Mexico and Latin American countries resonates, yes, first of all, the primacy of international law, the right of people's self-determination. In the case of Mexico, in some circles, it resonates with the memory of, they make this link of the Mexican Revolution of 1910 and its principles and values of land and freedom and of the peasant and environmentalist movements of more recent times. So I've seen photos and graffitis, and with photos, for example, of Emiliano Zapata waving the Palestinian flag, and, you know, and there is some acknowledgement. There is this acknowledgement also that some experiences bring both peoples, in the case of Mexico, Mexicans and Palestinians together. Among them, racism, stereotypes, the imposition of walls and border crossings, which, you know, separate, humiliate. Mexicans with the BDS movement have mobilized, for example, for instance, against Israeli technology. along the Mexican-American border security, and against Cementos Mexicanos, this cement industry in Mexico, which has a strong presence in Arab countries and in Israel, and which has participated in the construction of the wall in Gaza on the West Bank. So, and concerning the role Palestine plays in national politics in general, I mean, overall, Mexico, and particularly Mexico, has adopted a position of equidistance from all sides, but actually slightly more in tune with Israeli claims, and this can be associated largely, I would say, and I think this applies to many Latin American countries, different degrees, to Mexico's economy, trade. Mexico's trade is highly dependent on the U.S. And Mexico's economic agenda development model have been embodied in a particularly assertive economic and also intelligence diplomacy with countries like with Israel, for instance. So Mexico has also very pressing political security needs, including migration. And since 2000, Mexico has been facing challenges in developing migration policies as it transformed, as you know, from an immigration country into a country of return, transit, immigration, forced internal displacement. So, and there is this pro-Israeli lobbies, for example, in Washington, help raise this issue with the State Department officials, with key members of the U.S. Congress. You know, so it's something that really is important for Mexico. So for any government, and overall in Latin America, the role that Palestine might play in national politics in particular is normally little, unless there is an important diaspora, either Jewish or Palestinian, or a significant evangelical community. Yes. However, their influence must always be accounted for in relation to other factors, of course, political, economic, social factors. And this is actually what the differences in the degree of condemnation against the Israeli military operation in Gaza would suggest. In Mexico, there are around 67,000 Jews, for example, in a small community of people of Palestinian origin living in Mexico. We have more Lebanese, around 500,000. But these descendants of Middle Eastern immigrants, for example, have often constructed a Lebanese-Mexican identity based on the assertion of the Phoenician past. And a claim to uniqueness, and therefore they do not feel concerned with Arab and Palestinian affairs, so they don't mobilize really. In contrast, we have Argentina. Its Jewish community is the largest in Latin America. And you saw left-wing President Alberto Fernandez, who was just recently succeeded in office by Javier Milei, was one of the first Latin American presidents to show his support for Israel. Meanwhile, in Chile, with the largest Palestinian diaspora in Latin America, 500,000 approximately, President Gabriel Boric and his Minister of Foreign Affairs immediately and repeatedly have denounced Israel's indiscriminate violence against civilians, and they have done so since the beginning. Brazil and Guatemala, you have the evangelicals are a very strong element. They have pushed for greater links with Israel, and well, here economic interests intersect with political, social interests. Guatemala has one of the highest growth rates of evangelical population in the entire continent, and their influence can be determinant in this regard in Guatemala's and also El Salvador and Honduras, depending on the character of the regime and the quality of institutions. This is something that I have been exploring together with my colleague Kevin Partenay of the University of Tours. In the case of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras, we found that a deep diplomatic engagement with Israel in the past years coincides with a path of a democratic regression combined with a particular U.S. Pressures concerning the economy and immigration files.
Thank you very much. And that's very interesting research as well. So thank you for bringing that into the conversation. And for Omar, I mean, you've spoken a little bit already about the resonance in terms of, Muslim solidarities, the anti-colonial dimension. I'm wondering a little bit about the sort of grassroots activism that might maybe exist in Indonesia for the Palestinian cause. How does that, does that exist? Is there an important grassroots movement, and how does that express itself?
Yep, grassroots movement is particularly strong in Indonesia, and one thing that differentiates Israeli-Palestinian conflict with other issues that this is the only foreign policy issues that has been prominently endorsed through the grassroots solidarity. For example, I think in late November, one interfaith rally has been organized by the uh, Indonesian Ulama Council. So there is the rally was attended by the around 10,000, more than 10,000 people, I think. And then the rally was attended by the foreign minister and representatives of not only political parties, but also by leaders of major religion in Indonesia. So this is something that is becomes prominent right now because now interfaith leaders from different religious backgrounds through their support towards the Palestinian cause. And this is one important thing that I think has been prominently articulated in Indonesia in the last couple of years. Because in the past uh, uh, 20 years ago, the grassroots solidarity has been prominently based on the Muslim solidarity. Now, even the middle class Christian community, even the Buddhist and Hindu community in Indonesia, also being very critical towards the Israeli invasions. So this is not only about the pro-Palestinian cause, but also about the humanitarian impacts of the Israeli invasions. So this is something that characterizes the responses from the non-Islamic community. For the Muslim community, this is the pro-Palestinian cause is very much strong. But for the non-Muslim communities, the if humanitarian effects of the Israeli invasion is also stronger in this context, and also one of the hospital in Gaza, the Indonesian hospital was funded not by the government but by the Indonesian civil societies. This is something that has been prominently articulated by the Islamic civil society, and I think this is now in almost every big cities in Indonesia. The rally and the solidarity for the Palestinian cause is now stronger.
Okay, thank you very much. It's really interesting to get these different perspectives and see what are the factors that are leading or not leading towards this sort of resonance of this issue and how it works very differently in different places. All right, just looking at the time. So I'm just going to go quickly to the third question, which is not a small question, but if we could have your comments on that, and then we'll open it up for discussion, which is about to what extent this conflict could lead to geopolitical realignment of your countries. From what I'm gathering, actually, from what you're saying, it actually seems quite unlikely that the pressures in terms of the alignments that are existing go beyond solidarities with the Palestinian cause. But, you know, Roshan, you had talked a little bit about this, the non-alignment. Marta, you talked about this equidistant. Do you see that this conflict could lead to some forms of realignment, geopolitical realignment, from the perspective of your country, the country you're representing here? Marta, do you want to start maybe?
Yes, yes, it's not likely. I mean, it's unlikely. As you said, Latin America's geopolitical scenario is determined by the United States. And in face of this structural reality, the common ground they have, all these Latin American governments, left and right, and have found is to call for the respective international law to express humanitarian concerns, also given the lives claimed by the war. And this applies to left and right wings governments so far. So replacing this with a scenario in which countries in the region take dominant positions, for example, on one side or another in the conflict would exacerbate internal political polarization, which already is very strong in some countries, and regional fragmentation. But at the same time, there is a realization that neutrality, equidistance is not enough. And this is driving diplomatic positions in the region, as we've seen in Colombia, Chile, and Bolivia. And this dissatisfaction with neutrality, yes, might come from the left. Well, we might see the opposite reaction by far right wing political leaders in the region, who in some cases have been bolstered by cooperation with the Israeli military and intelligence services since the second decade of the 21st century. So only then, perhaps, if this continues, we would see a geopolitical realignment. But even then, it will be tied in one way or another to what Washington will do and will expect, what will happen in the Democratic Party, what will happen, so it's really tied to also the perceptions of these the perceptions these actors, regional actors, have of the United States' role in the conflict.
Thank you. And of course, you've mentioned that big question as well, which is what's going to happen in the US election in the coming year and how this will
Yes,
shape things
will be a game
very
changer.
significantly.
Yes.
Roshan, for you, same question about potential geopolitical realignment coming from this conflict and for the position of South Africa.
Well, I think South Africa was already very much looking at new geopolitical alignments. It's very active in BRICS, whatever people think of that, but it has been attempting to look at shifting away from being dependent on the West. And then the position it took is a non-aligned position on the Russia invasion of Ukraine. Again, brought a lot of hostility from the US in particular. And then now with the Palestinian struggle, I think South Africa multilaterally has taken very bold positions. Our foreign minister is very driven on the issue and very supportive of the Palestinian struggle. And in the African Union, she took a leading role to try to kick Israel out of having observer status, which it had got through an underhand way anyway. But more recently, even the African Union has been forced to take, at least in statements, make more pro-Palestinian statements. And the UNGA vote's interesting because Israel was looking to break the Africa group, being, the largest number of votes in the UN. And it's failed to do so. And I think the current situation has forced both through people mobilizing within countries, has forced governments on the continent, at least multilaterally, even though they still have these bilateral relations, many of them, has forced them to sort of put a bit of a break on that. So interestingly, I think it could have shifted the Africa group or the Africa bloc or the AU into a more pro-Palestinian frame of mind. I mean, of course, it's as has been mentioned, a lot of it's very much still around, using the concepts of international law that mean you speak to a two-state solution. But even that, it's beginning to be a little looser in some cases, not always. And I think it's also playing out in our domestic politics, because there's a very curious situation, and we have an election also next year, in which, for instance, the EFF, an opposition party, put a motion in Parliament calling on South Africa to end diplomatic relations and kick out the Israeli ambassador. And it was very uncertain if the African National Congress would support the motion. It did, in the end, support the motion. It's the ruling party, but now the government, who is the government, they are all ANC, is saying, no, we're not going to implement this, basically. We're not going to rush to implement this. So, but at the same time, they're looking at, potential votes of the Muslim community next year in the elections, particularly in the Western Cape, which is a large Muslim community, but also is controlled by the opposition Democratic Alliance, which is very tied to Israel. So there's a lot of contradictions in the way that it's playing out domestically, but it's definitely because of Israel's genocide and the kind of unprecedented story that's going on in Palestine. It has become in an election issue, directly in a sense, an election issue here, strangely, in a certain way.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, I hadn't realized that it was that salient in terms of the election coming up. And for Omar, the same question. Do you perceive or do you anticipate any sort of geopolitical realignments of Indonesia with regards to this conflict? Could there be any sort of repercussions down the line?
So yeah, I think I'm not sure that there will be a radical geopolitical realignment. But there are two things that we need to take into account regarding these geopolitical implications. First is that the Indonesia tends to be much more critical towards not only towards the United States but also with the Western countries in general. Because of the hypocrisy regarding the humanitarian protections and then with regard to human rights. And this is something that has been prominently raised by not only academic community, but also the Indonesian political party leaders who criticize the Western countries for hypocritical in protecting the human rights of the Palestinians and overemphasizing the Israel's right for self-defense. And this is something that I think would make Indonesia more critical towards the Western countries, even though I don't think that Indonesia will look away from the United States. Indonesia still have a very good engagement with United States in terms of defense, particularly now Indonesia also supports United States with regard to in the Pacific Economic Framework. But there is a second dimensions of these geopolitical implications, which is Indonesia's increasingly close relations with China. China has took similar positions with Indonesia, even though it's not so prominent that they support the two-state solutions. And this is something that I think Indonesia will play more roles and more closer positions toward China in working to establish to making the two-state solutions works in Palestine. Because what happens now is that even though United States and Australia, for example, supports the two-state solutions, in practice, they don't really put it as an immediate pathway for the conflict resolutions. So there will be increasingly close relations between Indonesia and China with regards to these positions. However, I think what happens next will be very much depending with the elections next year. Same with South Africa. Indonesia will have a general elections in 2024. So far, all of the three presidential candidates have a strong support for Palestine, but they propose different rhetorics, right? For example, one candidate, Ganjar Pranowo, who was supported by the ruling PDIP, the Nationalist Party, wants to propose the Palestinian independence as one of the foreign policy goal. Anies Baswedan, the opposition candidates, also share similar rhetorics. He's supported by the Islamic parties, and he wants to play Indonesia to play a more prominent role in the peace building. While Prabowo Subianto, even though less enthusiasms with the Israel-Palestinian conflict, he wants Indonesia to establish an embassy in Palestine. Indonesia now has a honorary consulate in Ramallah, But I think because Indonesia doesn't have diplomatic relations with Israel, then it's not operating very more in a long-term basis. So this is something that characterizes Indonesian elections. Although I think the geopolitical alignment would not be likely in a radical sense.
Okay, thank you so much. We only have 10 minutes left, so I think I will open it up now to the audience for any questions. I believe there might be a question here, yes, from Hazem. How can Christian Zionism be separated from Jewish Zionism in the long term? Or what is the future of the relationship between the Western Christian ruling elite and the Israeli regime? I believe this is a question for you, Roshan.
Well, I think Christian Zionism is a kind of a misuse of a theological argument. I mean, I'm not a religious person, so I can't quote the biblical references, but actually it's quite anti-Semitic because it relies on a book, I think it's Prophets, that says that once all the Jews are gathered there in what is Palestine, then on the judgment day, they must either convert or they will all be massacred. But conveniently, Israel forgets that last bit and has used this to create this story, which Christians tell me, Christians who have come out of, who feel like they've come out of a cult, actually, who've come out of this understanding of Christianity, that that they descend to Jesus and they replace the story with Israel. And there's a word for it, a type of a theological argument that's used. And for instance, they will take people, and millions of people go from African countries on pilgrimages to Israel. They never see what goes on, obviously, in Palestine. They don't know, they're not even told that there are indigenous Palestinian Christians. So it's a whole, kind of a propaganda and a very kind of, using a religious, it is like a cult, using a religious type of a thing to brainwash people into believing that the Israelites from the Bible and the state of Israel today are the same thing. The problem is it is very hard to counter because you need to use, in a way, theological arguments as well to counter it. People in South Africa, lots of people call Israelis Israelites. It's the association is from the Bible to everything that is going on there. But yeah, I think it's been very consciously created by Israeli Hasbara makers to do this. So I think it is totally possible to split it. And there are lots of, as I was saying, Christians who, kind of refer to the whole stories around, you shouldn't be going around killing people and Jesus and the birthplace of Christ and Palestinian Christians and so on and so on. So I think it's not, it's not inevitable, and there's not a sort of a political tie in a sense. It's like a propaganda and a cult that if you can get out of it, it's you can see you can see how it's been created to make you follow a certain political role that you're not even aware of. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yes, I think so. Yes, thank you. I don't see any other questions for the moment from the audience, so I will go ahead and use my moderator privileges and ask a question. And I'm wondering about, I mean, you've all mentioned throughout this discussion about the extent to which the popular opinion, but also the national political opinion, is very much anchored in international law and in that is sort of a compass, right, for politics and for the popular perceptions of the conflict. And I'm wondering right now, in this moment where we're seeing such a flagrant disregard for international law, has this in any way, or has this increased, I should say, the discrediting of the West, of discrediting of the United States, of these policies purporting to uphold international law? Have you seen an increase in that kind of discourse or that kind of even popular opinion of this discrediting of these frameworks and of the positions of countries like the United States or like Europe vis-a-vis international law and the idea of sort of upholding these normative standards?
As for me, I haven't seen any like recent survey, opinion polls in this regard. But I mean, I would, I suppose that, that there is some loss of credibility, which feeds into this anti-Americanism that we might find in many countries, including Mexico. But in the end, these do not really. The question is whether these kind of perceptions of can influence or influences directly or indirectly, but influences has an impact on foreign policy decisions of these states, and I don't see that happening in the shorter term, at least. And there are other factors that impinge upon that help explain this. This and also this very few potential of geopolitical realignments, because or in spite of these, this public opinion and the place of the United States and Israel, it might be becoming more, negative, this perception, and is the fact that there is a notorious deficit in regional leadership in Latin America, and there is an evident lack of more effective and sustained regional cooperation between Latin American and Middle East regions. And so even if you have like some part of the Brazilian population moving, and pretend, denouncing the US, denouncing Israel, or in Mexico or in other countries, you don't see in Brazil, for example, Lula's return to power takes place in a domestic and international context very different from that of the first decade of the 21st century. And particularly since the governments of Michel Temer, Jair Bolsonaro, Brazil's foreign policy has been reduced to commercial interest with Israel and with some Arab countries. So domestically, Brazilian political and social scenes seem polarized. And Itamaraty's role, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for example, in Brazil, was diminished. And I insist in Brazil because Brazil, at the beginning of this century, it was the leader of this initiatives of this boom of relations with the Middle East and with the Palestinian question, and waved this cause. And all this has reduced the possibilities of a sustained joint contribution to multilateral initiatives in spite of this public opinion, which is perhaps moving, more against, has this very negative perception of what the United States is doing or Israel is doing. So, so perhaps the main contribution at some point will come from attempts at reforming the UN Security Council. And that is where, perhaps we would see indirectly these national movements or these denunciations, being reflected, with this issue, which remains in the agenda of many southern countries.
Thank you. Roshan or Omar, did you want to respond to the question or to anything that Marta has said?
Yep, I think one thing that characterized the Indonesia's responses towards the Western hypocrisy in this context, that the foreign minister, for example, highlights how the Western countries only selectively applying human rights norms and human rights instruments for several issues, while neglecting some cases like in Palestine. And this is something that has been highlighted not only by the foreign ministers, but also by Indonesia's diplomats and community leaders, who highlights that we cannot accept the selective applications of human rights instruments, which it should be universally applied to all countries. And this is something that in the long term can reduce trust not only towards the democracy and human rights, but also towards the Western countries' leading roles in international politics. So I think what happens right now is that the selective applications of human rights and humanitarian protections, the negligence towards the Palestinian in Gaza, uh, shows that the Western hypocrisy can reduce its legitimacy and among the global South countries, and Indonesia is a country that is very critical, who is very critical towards this.
Okay. Thank you. Roshan, would you like to have a comment?
Yes, I think South Africa also has been calling out Western hypocrisy. There is a strong anti-US sentiment. But the danger is that people become frustrated with the whole concept of humanitarian law and universal human rights, because it feels like, well, we can't do anything. You know, our government has made a referral to the ICC, but we know that the chief prosecutor, I mean, he should really resign. He's not fit for purpose on this issue. But, you know, so the government has done that and says, yes, we want to prosecute the war cabinet and so on. But, you know, nothing moves. So people become frustrated with the whole idea of it. South Africa has long been arguing for reform in the UN, for instance. And you know that so that feeling that it serves the agenda of the West, that it's a select, you know, the international law and humanitarian protection is selectively applied. Again, with the situation of Ukraine, it was felt that very strongly, that, you know, everything that was being said and done in terms of the Ukrainian people, and now you can see how selective it is, because there's zero being done in the same way for the people of Palestine. So yeah, I think that's an issue, but I think this unraveling of international norms is also worrying, because, you know, then what do you have to rely on? Limited as they are in many ways, it ought to be ways in which you can at least deliver humanitarian aid or stop countries bombing schools and you know, UN refuges and stuff. So without that, I think it's kind of made it feel a more terrifying, and that the Palestinian struggle is really a touchstone for an international normative framework, actually, and for multilateralism.
Yes, that's very well said. Thank you very much. That actually brings us to our hour mark. So I want to, and we could go on and on. This has been wonderful, and I've tried to give you try to speak as little as possible to give you all as much room as possible to speak. I have to thank you all for being here, especially for the guests who are working outside of normal working hours. Marta is calling in from Montreal. It's very early in the morning, and Omar from Queensland, Australia. It's very late in the evening. So thank you, everyone, for these
Pleasure.
efforts to be here with us. As I said, their commentaries are available on our website, so please do read them to have more analysis here on these different perspectives. And we will be having more in this series in the new year. So thank you all very much.